All right. And I see it's 9:15. It's possible we're going to get, all right. So here's our schedule for the 9:15 panel. Thank you all for joining. Welcome to panel A1. We've got 3 papers ready to be presented here by Hyesun Jeong from the University of Texas, Arlington. One by Rebecca Kemper and Justin Meyer from the Ohio State University, Howling to Gen Z. And then Girija, Kaimal, and looks like Heather Spooner are here to present their paper as the 3rd one in this session.
Yes. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you, Doug and Joanna, for inviting me to this research workshop. Even though it's virtual, I'm truly glad to be connected with all of you. My name is Hassan Tom. I'm an assistant professor at UT Arlington. I will present my paper as a place, Café as a place of cultural innovation. This US Census chart shows what types of consumption amenities are rising or declining in the United States. As you can see, back in 2005, there were more number of bars than cafes. But since then, bars have declined and cafes gone up, and now it's #1 drinking amenity. Also, there was substantial increase of microbreweries, which was also interesting trend. Some of the classical amenities like bookstores and art galleries have been compromised by digital technology and e-commerce like Amazon or YouTube. So this chart generally shows the cafe culture is rising. And also lifestyle has greatly changed where people value more quality of food, health, and the sustainable environment. So what are the primary functions of cafe? These are drawn from past literatures. As Habermas said, cafes, coffee houses in London, 17th century, and French salons were public sphere where people gather and discuss different societal problems, regardless of their class or status. Also, cafe was historical place for artistic practice. As Balzac, Baudelaire, and Benjamin mentioned, painters and writers frequented in cafes in Quartier Latin and Montmartre in Paris and stayed there to get inspired. Also, as Oldenburg mentioned, cafes and coffee houses are one of 3rd place, which is critical to build a sense of community and also civic trust. Lastly, cafe is part of street urbanism. Jane Jacobs wrote her book, Death and Life of Great American Cities, and argued that density and mixed use of built environment is important to have more eyes on the street, which is great social capital and meaningful for social economic vitality. And her idea was greatly followed by new urbanists and sustainable planners. So in my research, I compare 3 popular cities, LA, New York, and Chicago, to study what is the relationship between the arts and the cafe. These maps present a percentage of artists and number of cafes in New York. I use GIS mapping to see the cluster and also photographs to capture the streetscapes. So Greenwich Village is well known for Jane Jacobs' home. It is still older and mixed community. It was in fact one of the places for first American Bohemian culture with LGBT movement. And there are more number of independent retails than corporate venues. East Village embodies youth culture as it has NYU and Cooper Union. There are a lot of night venues co-located with cafes. Brooklyn is actually emerging place for a lot of innovative artists and culture industries. So there are a lot of indie arts and music venues converted from warehouses, and there are a lot of murals. You can see them almost on every block. And what's interesting is that murals are not just decorations, but they are part of the subculture that delivers the message of social environmental movement and also diverse ethnicity. These maps show LA. So in LA, there are Melrose District and Art District as main clusters. Melrose District has a lot of hidden spaces and alleyways that are actually utilized for artistic productions and murals. And these actually create contrasting scene from West Hollywood, just north of this neighborhood. On the other side, Art District near downtown started with artists in residency program by the city in 1980s. And since then, many warehouses were transformed into artist studio, galleries, and cafes and restaurants. So those artists actually benefit from the location of Art District, which is near downtown and also access to public transit. So while LA is overall less walkable and not very pedestrian friendly, these two neighborhoods are actually successfully attracting more foot traffic and getting revitalized through street arts. How about in Chicago? Northwest side of city, around the Wicker Park, Logan Square, and Bucktown. Also downtown area, Loop area are two main clusters for arts and cafe. Wicker Park is famous of neo-Bohemian culture, as Richard Lloyd's case study. And Logan Square, Bucktown, surrounding area also have a continuous neo-Bohemian scene. And these neighborhoods, especially on Milwaukee Avenue, you can see a vibrant bicycle scene. The neighborhood, in fact, has the highest bicycle commuting in the city. Also, like Williamsburg in New York, they also have post-industrial scene, and they preserve Main Street, traditional Main Street form. So you can see a beautiful mix of old and new architecture on the street. Also, Wicker Park, Bucktown Chamber of Commerce closely work with community members and business owners to host annual festivals and cultural events. On the other side, Loop area has more large scale and iconic architecture and cultural institutions, such as Art Institute of Chicago, Millennium Park, Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and there are a lot of corporate coffee shops and businesses and mom and pop stores. Because it's downtown, it's highly walkable and has most number of transit stops. So even though corporate and chain stores relatively tend to have more uniform menu and decorations, some of local chain coffee shops like this one, it's actually right next to School of Art Institute. And this kind of coffee shops still try to build a strong relationship with the street, and they have outdoor seating, and they have nice landscape planters, and they also try to have more distinctive decoration. So this is scenes of three types of three cafes in 3 cities. So I classified cafe culture into 3 different types. First type is Bohemia, so-called Bohemia creative class by Richard Florida. So Bohemian scene is more surrounded by street arts and music performance. There are a lot of independent shops and tattoo parlors, more transgressive type of amenities, and they promote social movement, human rights, anti-war, women rights, LGBT. Also, you can see a lot of people cycling, and they often start in post-industrial location because rent is cheaper and artists can utilize the large space. Also, possible patrons are artists, entrepreneurs, and college students. And these are the examples of Bohemian scene. The second type is corporate and business, so-called Gesellschaft or society by Ferdinand Tönnies. So this type of scene is more associated with downtown or central business district. So they are surrounded by federal offices, high-rise buildings, hotels, large museums, and they have a more chain business and fast food restaurants. So there are more number of businessmen, office workers, and tourists because it's in downtown. The third type is traditional and communal, so-called community. So this type of scene is more communitarian, neighborly, and there are a lot of evangelical churches and family-owned business. And murals can also be more local, authentic, and reflect some ethnic roots. Possible patrons are more families and residents of the neighborhood. And Chinatown, Greektown, Bronzeville, and Howling are the example of communal cafe scene. So how do we measure cafe culture? I adopt Scenescape, written by Dan Silver and Terry Clark at the University of Chicago. It's actually ongoing international project. We have two main data sources, Yellow Pages and BZIP, Business Zip Code Pattern from Census. So from these two sources, we collected hundreds of amenities and classified and codified them into 15 scenes dimensions. As you can see, these are the dimensions that represent different characteristics of the neighborhood. So as a unit of analysis, each zip code has a score of 15 dimensions. This summarizes how I measure the three types of cafe scenes. You can check out my brief and the paper to see more details, but I re-realized the 15 scenes dimensions. So what is the relationship between cafe and the scenes dimension and other urban variables? So this correlation shows that cafes are more likely in bohemian or corporate places and less in traditional and communal places. Also, across 3 cities, as well as all metro areas, cafes are more located in denser, highly educated, walkable, bikeable, and artistic neighborhoods. What's interesting is for cafe, transportation and arts are more explanatory and powerful variables than cost of living, which are rent and income. Also, they are generally located in the same zip code with bakeries, bookstores, health clubs, tech firms, artists, and grocery stores. Specific to cities, New York has pretty much even distribution of this kind of amenities. So they have higher correlation with most type of amenities. In Chicago, cafes are more concentrated near art establishments and universities. In LA, by contrast, cafes have a lower correlation with most amenities except for shopping malls and department stores, which also reflect that LA has more auto-centric and spread out urban setting compared to cities. So I expand my research with multivariate regression with big data set. So main proposition is, do cafes produce more artists? And in which cultural context do they have more effect? These past diagrams show my propositions. And this table summarizes a list of variables I used in my regression. So I use cross-sectional data as well as change data of artists. And these show control variables of demographic, density, transportation, as well as cafe and culture scenes. So results show that cafes in Bohemia or traditional scene produce more synergy with artists. Places with higher education, rent, density, and transit, alternative transit result in more artists. What was more intriguing to me was that while cafes are more present in Bohemia or corporate areas, corporate business culture is actually unfavorable in settling or attracting more artists. And in city level regression, I find that alternative commuting is positive in number or change of artists in all 3 areas. So I have 3 recommendations for placemaking based on my study. First, cafe can be hybridized with different functions and programs. In Chicago, this one actually has a combination of bookstore and cafe in the same space. So there is a seamless connection between two programs. In Paris, this is in 18th arrondissement. This actually recycles abandoned rail station and rail track, and this provides the public program where people can participate in sustainable urban farming and farm-to-table activities. In Seoul, there are more than 13,000 cafes as of today, and there are a lot of new types of cafes and coffee shops. So like this one, it converted traditional courtyard house, and now it's flower shop, gallery, coffee shop, and even music performance stage combined. Also, there are other types of cafe, like this one, you can pet some animals for certain hours. So cities and communities also need to consider to build more public space near cafe. So this photo shows the first parklet built in front of Bicycle Cafe in San Francisco. It was successful and it has spread to other cities. And parklet is part of lean urbanism or tactical urbanism. So it extends sidewalk here with 1 or 2 parking spaces on the curbside. And according to the research from Metropolitan Planning Council in Chicago, parklet actually helps traffic calming, walkability, and promote economic activities and increase more sales of retail. Also painting crosswalk or bridges or street furnitures can also help create new types of street aesthetics. So these can be done relatively simply and also at a lower cost. And lastly, business owners can also extend their hours. These two photos contrast Wicker Park and the Loop area at 7 p.m. Both photos were taken in front of cafes. As you can see, Wicker Park is still active. There are a lot of eyes, foot traffic, whereas in Loop, even though you're in downtown, it doesn't feel quite safe, except for during summer. In summer, there are major events like Lollapalooza, Movie in the Park, Taste of Chicago, so you can see more people, but it's limited to summer. And I analyzed a business hour of stores in 3 types of scene, and Bohemian neighborhoods tend to open longer until late night. So it really helps extending foot traffic and street vitality. And when business owners extend their hour, they can use the cafe space for something else, like music concert, play, or exhibition. So they can have mutual benefit and the synergy with artists. So this is all I have.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hyesun.
Yeah, thank you.
So this is a moment where I'm going to need some technical assistance also from my technical people, because I'm having some problems on my end. But it looks like we're in good luck because Amy's taken up the charge and already has a question for us. So let's see if we can get Amy unmuted here. Hopefully Michael can help out with this, because I'm having tech problems on my end.
Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Great. Hyesun, thank you so much for that fascinating paper. It's really interesting, the combination of this kind of theory of the public sphere and the statistical work that you've done. I just have a couple of questions, and these relate to both the paper itself and the presentation. I really like how you started out the presentation and wonder if there's a way to kind of incorporate that into the paper. Coming from a political theory background, I felt stressed out the first 8 pages because I was like, please tell me Habermas is in this paper. Please tell me Habermas. And so you may be able to pull that further up. And then the 2 other questions I have just very quickly. One, the first chart that you showed, the first slide, I wonder if you've already thought through using a log scale on that, because you've got the churches at 100x and everything else at 10x. And it might be nice to try to get them on the same scale. Because I think it's actually quite interesting within your argument that churches are so much more present than cafes, just because you're looking at community spaces and their effect on the way people gather. And then when you look at the corporate type of cafe and you notice that there are not a lot of artists associating with those, I wonder if there's any other way. I was thinking about it from a data standpoint, if you could get salary information for artists and compare that as a ratio with rent per square foot, because I think there may be a difficulty pulling out the causal threads there, because there's probably a very different real estate cost that excludes artists on economic grounds. Or if you can just, if you may be able to touch on that as a kind of air gap in the causality of the argument. But it was really, really interesting, and those are the things I had in response.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for your feedback. So to respond your first question, the first figure, which showed the business census charts, actually the very initial version of it showed everything on the same scale. But then because there is large contrast in number and the unit especially between the bars, cafes versus churches, it's hard to show them at the same scale because you can't really see the little ones. So it was more for visual purpose to just, blow up the scale. But definitely I can also try to show maybe like categories, smaller categories, so that you can actually see the difference of those scales. And for the second question, I think it's great to incorporate how about the artist's salary or any kinds of return, right? I think maybe data is not publicly accessible because it's individual salary, but maybe I can access to the sales of those cafes and businesses. And even though it's aggregated, I think maybe, I can do that.
On the first chart, I was thinking if you used a log scale and converted the numbers, you might be able to get them on the same chart. You might not. I just didn't know if you had already tried that.
I have not, but I think that's a great idea. I can try to gather more physical data set and.
And I'm just curious. I've had that problem before where it's like too big to graph the difference in scale, but I feel like if you use a logarithmic scale, you may be able to do it.
Yes.
I'm not sure
about the first graph. Right. Yes.
Because I'm genuinely curious, because just the movement of churches is a noisy signal for me in that picture.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question, and hopefully at the end, if people have more questions, to come back. But Justin Meyer somewhere. Well, let's unmute you so you can ask your question real quick.
Hi, thank you, everyone. So really am interested in your research here. I'm a big aficionado of cafes. I'm sure many other people are. So I had a comment was, and as part of your theoretical framework, I wondered, and this just comes from my anecdotal experience, whether you considered the fact that cafes are also sources of employment for a lot of artists, especially in Bohemian type communities. At least that's my anecdotal observation, and that might be another connection that you can draw out. My question is about the causal argument, your hypothesis that you made in one of the slides, and it went by quickly, so I didn't see if you used time series data or looked at change over time, or whether you looked at a cross-sectional analysis. And I think whenever I hear it produced or something like that, when I hear kind of a causal argument, I was a little questioning what controls you had as far as time was concerned, and maybe new cafes opening up, some closing, etc. But then in your next slide, you said have this like synergy, and then that kind of that helped me a little bit. But I wondered what you were using for your causal argument.
So even though I used both cross-sectional and change data, the change data I used was just one time difference between 2012 and 2016. So I think I definitely need to collect and use more data from different years and see more causal relationship. But I think in both cases, both models, I find relatively consistent relationship between the cafe and artist, while all others being equal. So that's how I concluded, but definitely I can include more times so that we can see sort of pattern of how artists migrate around. So I think, yeah, I can definitely include more data set from different years and to see, yeah, more.
And I would also suggest maybe a matching technique to look to kind of approximate a counterfactual scenario, a neighborhood that has all of the similar qualities of a cafe neighborhood, but doesn't have the cafe, and then measure change in artists then. But anyway, that's my...
Right, yeah. That would be really interesting comparison.
Anyway, thank you so much. That was really interesting.
Yeah. Thank you, Justin. I think you're right. This does sort of call out for a matching approach. That's an interesting idea. So thank you, Hyesun. Let's all give her an actual or a virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation to start us all off. It's a great, we're starting off on a very strong foot. But I don't want to, I see Rebecca Kemper down there. I'm going to try to get her the appropriate privileges here. Actually, I'm going to have Michael do it. And we're going to kick off with Rebecca right now. Please.
Looks like I can't share my screen as it's disabled. Sorry.
You should get co-host privileges here that'll let you do it in 1 second.
Yeah.
Not yet? All right, well. There. Boom. Try it now.
Great. Thank you. All right. Okay, thank you so much. My name is Rebecca Kemper, and along with Justin Meyer, we are affiliated with the COSI Center of Science and Industry here in Columbus, as well as Ohio State University's City and Regional Planning Program. And we're going to be talking about Meow Wolfe today as a immersive art case study. In this presentation, we'll be talking about what is immersive art generally, cultural institution and neighborhood lifecycle connections to this innovative way of having an art and cultural institution, and completing a business case study analysis on this, on Meow Wolfe, and just touching very briefly on pandemic challenges with this model. So Meow Wolfe has a pretty interesting origin story. It started out with 2 draws from a hat to get its name in Santa Fe, and with an artist collective that decided to create an in-place experience. And its angel investor is actually George R.R. Martin, which is the Game of Thrones author. And so this is sort of the, they've sort of really launched this concept of immersive art within a singular institution framework. So when we think about art and cultural institutions, we typically have a schema of what gallery spaces will look like, right? We enter, we look at things on the wall, but this is kind of a new way of engaging within a space. And it's not that Meow Wolfe is the first to do this, but they're perhaps one of the first to do it within an entire gallery exhibition. So we've had, prior artists engage with this. We've also had crossovers within the virtual spaces. But Meow Wolfe is doing this within a 52,000 square foot institution within Santa Fe. And so when we're thinking about immersive art, it's a space that's about creating a holistic experience for the audience. It's something that you actually do enter and sort of swim through. And Meow Wolfe's large-scale installation in Santa Fe is not exactly play, it's not exactly museum, it's somehow both. And this is from DCS Media. So let's connect this concept of Meow Wolfe as a business and how it's connected with life cycles within cultural institutions and how it navigates neighborhood life cycles as well to remain competitive. So within cultural institution life cycles, we know from the literature that we have this concept that cultural institutions start with a compelling origin story. They transition into a conserving phase. They sometimes enter into uncertainty and then a renewal if they continue. So Meow Wolfe has this compelling story. It's been featured within, it has its own documentary. It's been featured within Rolling Stone. This is with the title, The Insane Art Collective Taking Over the World. So we know there's something unique happening here. And part of Meow Wolfe's strategy is really engaging with the neighborhood life cycle within urban spaces. So if we think back to sort of planning theory within neighborhoods, we have the concept that a neighborhood community will go through a growth phase of investment. It will have a stability phase. As the housing stock ages and as industry changes, there might be a decline. And then there's a revitalization phase if that neighborhood comes back online. So what Meow Wolfe has done is we have the Plaza, which is the traditional arts and culture district within Santa Fe. And it's located itself way to the south west of that Plaza district, across basically from a Walmart when it originally started. So this is out on the periphery of the city. And what we think about in terms of the city and that sort of relationship between art and cultural institutions, we have this concept of urban revitalization and activating spaces and having arts and cultural institutions come in, and those institutions taking advantage and promoting agglomeration effects within the creative industry sector. And then we have creative districting, formal, but they're kind of doing this in the reverse. They're actually looking for spaces that are underutilized and low overhead to engage in, and then are drawing in creatives. So this is actually Meow Wolfe's first location, which is the House of Eternal Rise. And this is what it's located 4 miles outside of Santa Fe's traditional arts district. It is a converted bowling alley, which is why it's so large. And so you can see a very traditional suburban commercial space layout to have all this innovative installation work inside. And so their angel investor again is George R.R. Martin. And he has been singing their praises since they began, and he helped them purchase that particular commercial building. And this concept of immersive art is spreading. Even we have sort of, Meow Wolfe gave a shout out to Otherworld, which is here in Columbus, same model, using a commercial space on the periphery to do immersive art installation. So this concept is spreading as a business model. So we applied the business case study analysis framework, which was originally developed by Harvard University's Business and Administration, now Harvard Master's Program, and is still used today. And this analysis framework considers the operational environment of a organization, its industry, its organization, and its management. So sorry for the small chart, but these are all the criteria in which you use within this analysis. And we used a sample of business and business profile documents in order to fulfill and answer these questions about how Meow Wolfe is positioning itself. Now, again, Meow Wolfe is kind of interesting. It's not a nonprofit, it's a B corporation. So at the outset, they have always maintained being for profit, which is interesting. So when looking at the sample and deciding on the sample for this analysis, we wanted to look at documentation that was coming out during its origins and during its conservation phases. So basically, when it hit sort of the market and had public awareness, so 2014 to 2019 is when these documents happened for our population sample for this analysis. And, oh, let me skip a phrase here. And go back over here. So when we're looking at this analysis, what we find within looking at these documents is a few things. So the operational environment, Meow Wolfe has done a great job of positioning itself as a for-profit B corporation. So it benefits from having community connections and meaning, but it also is able to stay a little bit more leaner within a operational environment in which cities are just not, in many ways, providing institutional support. So if we think back to when Wolfe was started and really became rooted in the 2010s, what is important to note here is that we're still coming out of the Great Recession fallout, and we still had limited ability for municipalities to support such organizations. Also, this is a very atypical type of organization. So maintaining that B Corporation for-profit status allowed it to really navigate that operational environment well at its beginning. Within the industry framework, when we're completing this analysis, what is interesting is that it has sort of that it sort of straddles the art and culture industry, but it also straddles entertainment. So it promotes and creates a lot of opportunities for more traditional art and culture institutions to locate in the district it is now, and that has been happening. But it has a pretty strong entertainment value coming in because of that immersive quality of the installations. And so what we find is that it's really become aggressive in terms of trying to expand this model into other cities. It's located right now in parts within Las Vegas, and it's kicking off in Denver, and is even looking into Columbus, Ohio, where we have Otherworld also operating right now. So it is trying in many ways in terms of where it's positioning itself to be aggressive, but that has some drawbacks within its organization and management. So what we see when reviewing these documents is that from an organization standpoint, it hasn't really stopped being in a quote unquote startup mode because it is being very aggressive in trying to expand within different cities that have a very different dynamic in terms of its local creative class. That's good in the sense that it's probably trying to skip over in many ways, falling into decline within the public's eye, but it makes it very vulnerable to any sort of exogenous shocks within the economy or any changes within the ability for folks to visit, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute, just given our current pandemic situation. That organizational strategy in terms of growth and planning has also challenged a bit of its management. So its management style, while its staff is much larger and requires things like HR departments and everything else because of its size, the management style still feels very flat, even though we do have production needs that are much more on scale with much larger institutions. So this is something to kind of think about when considering Meow Wolf. It's lean and mean, but it's going to need to transition into a way of operating so that it can sustain itself through change. So here's those criteria again and the sample. And what I would like to conclude with briefly is that we are kind of facing a brave new world within art and culture institutions. The UN has recently had a report that came out that said as much as 1 in 8 museums will probably close because of the pandemic. And when we're thinking about something like immersive art experiences, these are very high touch experiences. And Meow Wolf itself has a revenue generation that's very much being sustained through gate or being through ticketed experiences. So it's hard to see how it's going to pivot itself, especially as it's right in the middle of expanding and is quite vulnerable to expanding into new cities like Denver and Las Vegas and Columbus. And it was expending a lot of capital, both human and financial, to make connections with those local communities. What that will look like now, because it has a bit overstretched itself. So thank you. I just want to end on that note. Yeah.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Rebecca, and to your co-author, Justin. Appreciate it. So let's throw it open for some questions here. Let me see if we can unshare the screen. We can go back, perfect, to the gallery. And anybody with questions here? Adrienne.
Hi, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I have a lot of thoughts. One question I have, it's a preoccupation of mine, is issues of labor policy within this neoliberal structure that we find being, depending on your perspective, currently calcified or dismantled. I'm not sure. I think the jury's still out. So I just wonder if you are, Meow Wolf is really complicated. It's actually experienced a protest on that labor front. So I'm just curious about, I'm sure it's in your notes somewhere. I wonder how that comes in to the body of the paper.
No, I think that's a great question. And it's why I wanted to at least give a little bit of lip service to the pandemic, even though that wasn't quite part of our original work and research was that, yes, Forbes came out, Artworld came out with news, and Santa Fe Reporter came out with news of how the layoffs were happening within the Meow Wolfe locations and sort of the conflicting narratives around that. And that how that's really doing some image damage to Meow Wolfe, who has positioned itself as being trying to bring up artists through the ranks, right, and trying to create opportunities for artists that would normally be potentially overlooked because they are seated in historic sort of disinvestment neighborhoods on the periphery. So I think it's a great question. I will say that our analysis didn't quite get into the nuts and bolts of labor policy per se, but it is something that has to be on your radar and is, of course, a concern of any sort of urban planner, right? I think their strategy of starting first as a loose artist collective that would kind of just do house parties and hop around until they formed their identity and then went all in. It was strategic of getting an angel investor once they sort of calcified what they wanted to do. I think was an interesting one and one of a lot of strength, which is why we wrote about it. But it does lend itself to a lot of questions about what does this look like from a sustainability standpoint that's just for the laborers too. So thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Other questions? Remember, there we go. We've got Shoshana.
Okay. So my question is this entity entertainment or is it art? Or does it straddle both of those things? And if it's entertainment, then is it about tourism or kind of how is it fitting into the, classic art world and versus, Disney for Gen X and Gen Y and Gen Z?
And yesies. And hipsters. No, it's a good question. I think when we were doing our analysis and we were having to identify the industry, we did say it's straddling entertainment and cultural institutions in operation for what it's doing within the district in terms of creating spaces that's out in this periphery for separate galleries, separate maker spaces, coffee shop, like the artisanal eateries, everything else. In that way, it seems to be functioning much more like a cultural institution and bringing in that kind of investment. It appears to be doing that. We'd have to do a formal sort of analysis of land use and all that fun stuff. But anecdotally, it seems to be operating in a way, in terms of these neighborhood life cycles, the way we would expect a cultural institution entering at a period of disinvestment to sort of ramp up that cultural industry. That being said, I think the fact that it is straddling into entertainment and the fact that it's really struggling during the pandemic is suggestive that it's maybe not quite as cultural as it thought it was. So it needs to find more authentic ways to engage with those local creatives. That would be sort of my critique here. And if it really wants to get playing in that space, it needs to engage a bit more. So does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
All right, I think we've got time for one more question, and I got one in the chat room from Amy. So I want to her up. Last word.
I think this is another flip side of Adrian's question about the labor economics, which is the IP financial upside sharing relationship with the exhibiting artist, and your take on the recent Space Owl lawsuit. I think it's an interesting awkwardness of there being a B corporation.
Yeah. No, it is. And I think that's where we're seeing the tears of how benevolent these sort of B Corps can actually be when stressed. I would argue that cultural institutions proper are they're fighting that same fight right now. That there is a big struggle between how much of their mission work do they complete while trying to struggle with just basic revenue generation to keep the lights on. That being said, I think what really helps coming into these situations is having, and again, that's something that kind of came out of our business analysis framework, was that the management just had not gotten out of that startup mindset of, just really forcing overwork and not a lot of fair compensation, having questions about that, right? That it was always in an expansion mode. So I think with these institutions being critical about when it's okay to sort of turn the gas off and really think about that, getting into that conserving stage is important. It's just unfortunate that Meow Wolfe has gotten itself sort of caught up in this as well. So I share your concerns, and I hope it's something that every emergency can be an opportunity from a management standpoint, and I hope it's something that causes them to pivot and not cease existing. So.
I think I get at this that in the paper I gave this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so it's more of like an investment question, I think, than an operations question.
Okay.
Because they promised the artist investment rights. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Thanks. Sorry, Noonan.
All right, very good. Well, let's have a round of applause here for Rebecca's excellent paper. Many hands clapping virtually. Thank you. Well done. And now we'll turn over to our third paper here from Girija out in Drexel. And she has a co-author, President also Heather Spooner. I'm going to find her and unlock her as well.
And Doug, can you also add Melissa? She's also here. So unmute as well. Melissa Walker.
There she is.
Yeah, towards the end, I think.
Oh, we already got her on mute. I double.
Yeah, there you go. All right. So,
there, Melissa.
So should I do share screen now?
Yep, go ahead.
All right. Okay, let me make it slideshow. Can everybody see? Yeah? Okay. So we are coming at this from our backgrounds as art therapists and professionals working at the intersection of arts and health. So we are very interested in this concept of exhibitions and how that can be expanded in scope and beyond what we think of as traditional exhibitions. So exhibitions traditionally occur in museums or designated public spaces. And we wanted with this paper to present the many different ways in which exhibitions can be imagined, especially coming from our clinical practice in art therapy. So we have 4 case examples that we'll share with you. One in a radiation oncology unit in a large urban hospital, one at the National Endowment Center of Excellence in Bethesda, Maryland, another one which is with a veteran, but more focused on online interactions, and lastly, expanding the idea of the space itself as being beyond just looking at, say, something on a wall or something that's displayed, expanding the idea of exhibitions to examine the space itself. And that is what my colleague from Johns Hopkins has shared. She's not here today, so we'll try to summarize some of that work. All right, so the first example. Now, this was work done actually as part of the NEA Research Labs. We were one of the first 4 labs funded in 2017 through the NEA Research Labs program. And one of our studies was to examine the impact of art therapy for patients and caregivers in a radiation oncology unit in a large urban hospital. And this was the first time that this service was offered in the hospital. And we wanted to take this idea of research and dissemination beyond just academic audiences alone. So we wanted to share the findings from the study with the community in the hospital itself. So patients, caregivers, healthcare providers. So what we found in our study was that even a short session or a short interaction with an art therapist can significantly improve mood self-efficacy, reduce stress, and also reduce burnout amongst healthcare providers. Traditionally we share this at, academic papers or in academic presentations, but with support from the NEA Research Labs as well as the hospital, we decided to share the findings in the hospital waiting room. So what we did was we had 57 participants, and we made sure we had all their artwork. Every single person had their artwork exhibited. This is the waiting area of the hospital. And in addition, we had representative quotes from the participants included in the exhibition itself. So this was a way that we figured out to respect participant confidentiality, as we would do in research, but also share key findings. So what you see, those bands over there are quotes from participants where they talked about, the initial challenges and then enjoying the experience, the difference between being focused versus distraction as a mechanism of therapeutic change, the ability to share experiences that they might not have been able to share anywhere else, and recognizing the very real psychosocial and spiritual challenges of facing cancer treatment, which can potentially be terminal. Many of these patients had advanced cancers, so their minds were in a different place. This exhibition was supposed to stay on for a week, but by popular demand, it ended up staying on for a month in the hospital. We also had a community engagement corner, so visitors to the exhibition could also create art and share that in the space. We think of this as an example of exhibitions as a way to engage, educate, as well as share and democratize what we think of as artistry and who we think of as artists. All right, so I'm going to move on now to the next example. This, Melissa will share her work and how she sort of reimagined exhibitions at the National Endowment Center of Excellence. Go ahead, Melissa.
So I'm Melissa Walker. I'm a Department of Defense employee, but I'm currently detailed to the National Endowment for the Arts, where I'm the lead art therapist for our Creative Forces NEA Military Healing Arts Network. But I'm also, in the beginning of August, I'll go back full-time to the National Endowment Center of Excellence, excuse me, where I'm a Healing Arts Program Coordinator and an art therapist. And so the NICO is up at Walter Reed in Bethesda, Maryland, and we are a facility which cares for service members and veterans with traumatic brain injury and associated psychological health conditions. And there we integrate conventional military medicine and complementary and integrative medicine under one roof. We have an intensive outpatient program which lasts 4 weeks, where service members from all over the country come for an immersive holistic care model. And then we have a longitudinal outpatient care model as well. So this is the art therapy studio. It's a dedicated space to where the art therapy occurs, which is very important for, of course, having these servicemen and women feel comfortable to engage in art therapy. But it has also allowed for us to take the products that they create in the art therapy sessions and display them. This is based on their option to do so. They are offered the opportunity to either take it home or to their next care facility to continue to process what they've created, or they can leave it behind. And what we found is that many of the service members want their work displayed because they feel it creates a visual community for both themselves and their peers, but also they can bring their family members in and their treatment providers and talk about the work they've created. And I've partnered with Girija with some of our Creative Forces research, and we have been able to see that what they're creating in art therapy is an actual visual representation of what's going on, what they're most worried about as they go through treatment. And right now we're going to research on how that correlates to what's going on in their brains. But one of our most important findings is that if a service member depicts symbolism surrounding a strong sense of military community, and or they have a lot of sense of purpose within society. If they're patriotic or they're very into their military identities, if they symbolize that in a cohesive way, that they have lower PTSD and anxiety and depression scores. So what that tells us is that community is extremely important. It's a protective factor for this population. And we've had many of the service members talk about how displaying the work in the gallery, as I've mentioned, creates more comfort knowing that their peers have come through and have engaged in this before, but also creates a visual community when you walk through and look at the walls and realize you have fellow peers who have been through in the same units. We've actually gotten to the point now where we will group the artwork based on unit and symbolism. And there's even a whole line of military spouse masks. And so as they walk through, they're able to kind of relate to that. I'm just going to add one more thing. We have let the artwork leave the walls of the NICO. No names are on the artwork unless they're comfortable within the actual space. But when they leave the NICO and they're in more public spaces, we keep it confidential, anonymous. Just recently, we put together a big exhibit in partnership with the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Museum of Health and Medicine, and the Kennedy Center's Reach building. And literally the day before we were going to set it up, COVID, there was a shutdown with COVID, but we were really excited to take this work and put it in a more public space and see how it impacts the viewers. We were also excited to kind of extend beyond the art therapy product, but into populations of the military who went through art therapy and then continued to create art on their own and their individual lives. And so we did have a piece of that where after going through art therapy, the service members had perhaps retired from the military and become veteran artists and who were opting to showcase their work using their names. And actually, I think this will be a nice segue into Heather's presentation, but so just keep an eye on that. Yeah, so I think that's it for now. Girija, do you want to add anything based on what we've done together?
No, I think you got it covered. I think expanding this idea of what is the purpose of exhibitions, not just something you might visit, and, but that it's really integrated into clinical care.
Yes, and I think I want to add that it anecdotally from our service members, they've said that it really helps them to communicate what's going on, obviously visually, but then they can also, like I said, bring their families up to it and say, this is what I created and this is what it means to me, as well as they're leaving it knowing others are going to see it. So I think it really destigmatizes mental health and physical, psychological injury, and it validates their wartime experiences. So it's been, it's something I like to call their visual voice. And, even the providers say, oh, it gives us this other snapshot of what's going on with the patient that we wouldn't have had, based on pure verbal interaction. And mask making is just one directive that we do within that 4-week program. Just want to add, but it is standardized. So we have thousands of them. And so it is the majority of what's hung in the studio, but there is other artwork as well.
All right.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and start. I'm Heather Spooner. As with Melissa, my work kind of spans a few different places. So I'm faculty at the University of Florida Center for Arts and Medicine, but I also work as an art therapist within the North Florida, South Georgia VA health system and work with Creative Forces as their lead telehealth creative arts therapist. And so this program that we did the exhibition through is actually a hybrid telehealth program. It started back in 2014 before telehealth became all of our reality. And it was a clinical demonstration project. So we were really tasked by the VA Office of Rural Health with identifying whether or not what we did as art therapists in a clinical environment could be translated to telehealth, what that looked like, what maybe didn't work so well in that context, and also what opportunities or possibilities could arise from it. And there were a few things that we found fairly quickly. One of the things we noticed was that the veterans were really developing more of a sense of this artist's identity when they were working in their home environment. We set them up with art supplies in their home. They have to create space and studios in their home. Families are involved and kind of naturally see what's happening, and they're working with it more between sessions. So suddenly it wasn't becoming just something that they did with their providers in session, but something that they were bringing into their home life. The example that you're seeing here is from a veteran who really was unable to talk about her experiences and what she had been through clearly. And so initially she came in and I didn't even think I was going to see her again. She took a break and came back a few months later and said she wanted to work with fabric and tell her story through fabric and quilting. And I know nothing about quilting, but another thing that we've been able to do through telehealth is really get people to work with people in their communities. And so she went out and found a quilting group. They did flowers and log cabin patterns and traditional quilting. And she wanted to tell a story about her trauma and her experience as an Army officer. And they were great. They totally worked with her. They worked with her on the craft. I was working with her on composition and how to tell her story. You can see in this image where even though it looks beautiful from a distance, that face is really telling that story of what was happening behind there. And we had an opportunity to exhibit this at the VA. And so not only is it, in general, was it great for the entire VA community to see what all of the veterans had created, but this created an opportunity for her in particular to invite those people who had supported her to come meet with me as the provider, talk about those different facets of that process, and begin to really tell this story. I mean, she could not even share it with me in a clinical environment. Our first meeting, she went to sharing it within this small group of quilters, and now suddenly had to share it very publicly with everybody there, reporters, people asking questions. And from that experience went on to enter it both in the VA's National Creative Arts Festival, where she won first place in her division. And also she entered it into an international quilt festival. And this was one of the pieces that was scheduled to be in the Kennedy Center exhibition that Melissa was talking about, but that has been postponed due to COVID. I'm gonna stop and hand this over to Girija. I'm seeing some time warnings and I want her to have a chance to wrap this up. Go ahead.
Thank you, Heather. So I think we probably have a minute. I'll just quickly go over this case example. These are two different spaces designed to evoke specific emotions and responses. And this was an effort led by the Johns Hopkins University International Arts and Mind Lab. And they were tracking participant responses using biometric measures in these two spaces. The idea being that we go beyond individual art pieces to the space itself and all the components in the space as transforming and therapeutic. So I think one room was focused more on relaxation and the other more on invigoration. All right. So that is our presentation overall. The implications of this is really to examine further what exhibitions mean for us in the community and how we might innovate and examine new ways of sharing that promote health and well-being and help us kind of take the exhibition beyond the traditional interpretation in museums. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Girija. Very interesting stuff. We got some applause coming around virtually. We'll give another round at the end. But let's open it up for some questions from anybody in the gallery. All right, Adrian. 1 second, we'll get you unmuted here.
I did it myself. It's so many things. It's less guidance and more enthusiasm for a few key words. One was visual voice coming out of the visual arts. I find that to be a really positive, provocative term, and I love when there's crossover between disciplines. So I just wonder if you've thought at all or touched on social practice within the visual arts and socially engaged art. And I can put this into the chat, but Harold Fletcher out of PSU and the MFA in social practice has a lot of material about crossing over between sectors and how it still remains art, even if it's acting, functioning, looking, smelling, breathing, and seeming like something other than art. I'd just be curious to see how expansive the idea of exhibition gets within the visual arts.
Mm-hmm.
But I really appreciated that, the work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And actually, that's one of the criticisms we've received is that, what is the theoretical foundation for some of this? And the response I would have, and I think coming from our discipline, is that, art therapy is really a discipline that came from clinical practice, from helping people who otherwise did not have a voice. I'm struck that you recognize that. And we think of art therapy as really helping individuals say the unsayable, things for which they might not often have words. So it's really kind of led from individual and community practice. And much of what we do is kind of just trying to dispel some of the fears and stigma around self-expression. So definitely welcome your, and I'm grateful for your comment. Melissa, I don't know if you want to add anything because you brought up the visual voice piece.
That is so important because, and this speaks to what Girija was just saying, but we have to think very intentionally anytime we leave the clinical space, because it's not a typical gallery exhibit that's there for aesthetic purposes. It's not meant to be judged, so we don't want critics coming in and talking about the quality of the artwork. It's about the meaning of the artwork. And so when we were putting together, for instance, the Kennedy Center exhibit, we were extremely intentional about, as you move through the space, what narrative, what story is being told about these individuals' journeys. So it was going to start off with more traumatic content and then move towards more hopeful content as they move through their treatment journeys and retire from the military and become autonomous. And so we were thinking it was very important socially for the viewers to come through and understand the meaning behind the work, and that this is there to be, again, their voice. And I think I would add that if for some reason, for instance, the Kennedy Center can't occur because of COVID, we are hoping for an online virtual gallery on our soon to be launched National Resource Center. And I do think we want some social interactions and people's responses to the work to be collected. And I know Girija and I have been talking about this for a long time, and I'm sure that you will be involved when we do that, to try to figure out kind of some kind of response, whether that be like another art piece maybe that's created within the community or surveys. So yeah, that's a very important question. Thank you.
Heather, do you want to add anything from your perspective?
No, I know time-wise we're fairly short, but we've done a few exhibitions, and the other piece that I think wasn't captured in this example is I've also found where other people are able to use these exhibition space therapeutically. And so one of the exhibitions we had, providers and staff and other people were coming to the gallery and kind of using that as part of their treatment. So not just taking the art outside of therapy into the community, but taking the therapy into the art spaces, which was really interesting and something we couldn't cover here.
Mm-hmm. And one more thing, I think, thank you, Heather. I think I just realized to talk about is bridging the gap between the civilian and the military community. And the veteran community. There's just such a large, not a large percentage has served. And so I think sometimes they have a hard time figuring out how will people understand me and what I've been through. And so this could be a way to do that for them. So for all of us to understand the wartime experience.
Great. Thank you. All right, so I want to break in here and give a chance so we can give a nice little round of applause to Girija and her group, Melissa and Heather, for a wonderful presentation. Well done. Thank you. Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left in this panel, and we definitely have time for more questions, but I want to also remind people that it can be for any of the groups, certainly for this last one, but any of the first two papers as well. Your last chance, for now at least, to get a question in or a comment and some feedback back to the authors. I will say, so far I'm impressed and proud of session A1 for being engaging and active and not being shy in Zoom or just popping off to make more coffee or something. So thank you all. Any other questions? Yeah, there we go, Adrienne.
To follow up on this last presentation, one other thing that stuck out is you talked about telehealth, and I'm acutely aware as a professor in studio art of our need to teleteach. And I'd be really curious to see what kind of cross-pollination is possible between those of us who are teaching the arts online and trying to figure out how to deliver a studio experience online, and the healthcare space in which you're trying to deliver therapy or et cetera.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I feel like I need to step back and think about that more. I actually do both, because through the center, our graduate programs are all online. And I will say we do creative practices with the students where they have to kind of share virtually, and they have for some time the work they're doing. And I've often been inspired by things the students have found for ways to adapt what I'm doing with the veterans. But I don't know that I've put real energy into kind of intentionally looking at those overlaps and differences. I'd be interested in having that conversation. If you want to take that offline, it'd be great to talk about some more.
And I would also add, what this is also pushing many of us is to examine actual digital tools. So, you could take the screen interface, this two-dimensional screen interface between in the teacher-student interaction, but what if we took it, completely digital? What does this mean for new media and art media that's completely digital, including virtual digital tools?
Good. Any other questions or comments? We'll pause for a second for someone either to type quickly or find that blue hand to raise. Well, I'll say that I think that this is a really interesting panel to start off with. So we called it, Arts Entrepreneurship in the Field, and I particularly liked the sort of field grounded outside of the ivory tower perspectives that we saw. So we have exhibitions out in the field practicing, but we're also sort of getting into whether it's the cafe, things that are actually grounded out there and seeing that experience. And I think that's very interesting to see how this plays out. So, and maybe we set this all up well before a pandemic struck. So I think it's also interesting to see how, when we're out in the field in the subject of our work, how a current event that prevents us from going out in the field pretty much interacts with that experience. And so I know we discussed it a bit in Rebecca's talk, and it just got mentioned again for sort of whether it's telehealth and some of the aspects on the therapy. I'm curious if Hyesun has a perspective on COVID-19 meets the cafes, or if anyone else wants another word on this. And there you go.
Yes, so I think, well, we all know COVID-19 has largely impacted cafes, and not just cafes, but all kinds of retail, right? So, but when we think about creating more cultural place and public space, I think those cafes, especially the small scale cafes, have more closer relationship with the community. And I think one of the greatest assets they have is that they can actually collaborate with nonprofits and community organizations to rebuild this trust and really work together to create another new public sphere where people can interact each other. And I think COVID-19 also teach us the lesson that we still value so much personal, physical interactions, right? So I think this is a great opportunity for us to think about the future scenario of cafe and other types of, social space.
Good, thank you. All right, well, let's take this last second here to give a big round of applause for all three presenters and the teams involved in each. Excellent research, excellent presentations, everyone. We're off to a great start. We've got a 15-minute break here for you to go pour another cup of coffee, find your own bagels. I don't have a coffee and bagel station side of the room waiting for each of you to go and invade. I apologize for that. But go take a little break. We'll be back at 10:45, whether it's back in room A on the Zoom or pop over to room B, your choice. Thank you all. See you soon.
Thank you all. Very interesting. Take care.